You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about positive solutions to environmental challenges. Solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe? How to plant a food forest? Restorative design or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned for Sustainable World Radio. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier. My guest today is Dr. Lee Reich. Lee is a writer, scientist, horticultural consultant, and educator with graduate degrees in soil science and horticulture. Lee is a former plant and soil researcher for the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Cornell University. His books include Weedless Gardening and Growing Figs in Cold Climates. Lee wrote a syndicated gardening column for the Associated Press for nearly 30 years. You can find Lee online at leereich, REICH.com. And Lee's farmden, which is his term for his more than a garden, less than a farm piece of land, has been featured in many publications like the New York Times and Martha Stewart Living, and has won awards from National Gardening and Organic Gardening magazines. Lee, I'm so happy that you're here today joining me on the show. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And do you think you're ready to distill your, decades, 30 years maybe, or over 30 years of knowledge into the next 45 minutes?
Definitely.
Oh, good. Okay, we better hurry, right? Before we start, though, I would love to get a picture of your farmden, which you write is more than a garden and less than a farm. So if the listeners and I were there with you right now, what would we see and smell and maybe hear and possibly eat, hopefully eat?
Right. So I guess when you came up my driveway, you would see, that's not a farm. There's a whole bunch of potted plants. I grow a lot of subtropical, fruits are one of my special interests, and I grow a lot of subtropical fruits that are not hardy here in the Hudson Valley, I'm in zone 5, so a lot of them wouldn't live. And those plants include, I have an olive tree, and one year I did harvest, and it's in a pot. One year I did harvest 6 olives from it. I have some citrus. But anyway, then you walk through this breezeway and you're sort of, it looks to me sort of like a Garden of Eden, because overhead, you come on a terrace and overhead there's grapes. And then straight ahead there's my north vegetable garden, which has a lot of vegetables, and going around one side of it are about 20 varieties of dwarf pear trees. In back behind it is about 15 or 20 varieties of gooseberries and about 5 varieties of grapes. And then on the left side of that, as you're looking out, is my pride and joy, which is my blueberry planting, which is very noticeable because it's totally netted against birds. I used to call it my blueberry cage, but that sounded not all that bucolic or tasty. So I changed it to my blueberry temple. And that is the best. It's interesting because I did my graduate research in blueberries, and my most successful fruit crop has been blueberries. I've never not had a full crop of blueberries. So we have 16 plants here. And from those 16 plants, we typically harvest about 200 quarts of blueberries, and all but 75 quarts go into our stomach. And then the rest are frozen for winter.
Oh, that's incredible. What a bountiful plant.
Right. And then there's a field of about 1.5 acres. And if you went down that field, you come up to another vegetable garden, a smaller one, and the greenhouse. And the greenhouse is home to fig trees. Well, it's a cool temperature greenhouse. So in winter, I grow greens, like lettuce and celery, things that like cool temperatures, and basically they can provide us with fresh salads all winter. But I also grow fig trees in there in winter. So I have 4 fig trees in the ground. They have trunks about, 6 or 7 inches in diameter, and they're trained as espaliers, which is a two-dimensional system. I mean, it's a two-dimensional where it looks very pretty and it's also very functional, especially for the fig trees, the way I prune them. And the nice thing about the figs is they're deciduous, so they don't shade or compete in winter at all with the vegetables. And then the greenhouse also in spring, I raise all my seedlings in the greenhouse. It's not that big a greenhouse, it's only 20 by 20 feet. And then moving further down the field, I have a whole collection of hardy kiwi fruit, European black currants, and Paw Paws. And then another row is apples. And I wrote a book a number of years ago on uncommon fruits, which is going to be reissued at some point in the next couple of years. So I grow a lot of uncommon fruits, which the hardy kiwis and the pawpaws are among them. But also I have persimmons in that row, and the next row over I have apple and plum. But I also have medlar, an uncommon fruit. And I also have some varieties of mulberry. And then moving back around the house, this might be more than you asked for.
No, this is so amazing because Lee, you are known as the uncommon fruit expert in permaculture circles and in the gardening circles that everyone's like, "Oh my gosh, the uncommon fruit guy. This is amazing." So it does sound like you're kind of brimming over with fruit. And I think it's interesting today that we are going to be talking about how you build and manage the framework, right? The soil to grow this abundance of plants and produce and fruit. And do you have anything else on the farmden that you want to mention to people, or should we dive into some questions?
Yeah, I'm not done yet.
I know.
So then if you head around and towards the front,
Uh-huh.
I have a small collection of Asian pears trained as espalier. And then I have a collection of filbert nuts or hazelnuts, which are one of my favorite nuts. And then towards the front of the property, I have some chestnuts and English walnuts. And then all around growing wild here, one of my favorite nuts is black walnuts. So we harvest them, they just pop up all over. Squirrels keep planting them. And we have basically a year's supply of those. And then way at the far end of the field, about 20 years ago, I wanted to plant a little forest because this is mostly open, which is nice. It's all sunny. But I thought a little forest and shade would be good. So I planted a few sugar maples and some river birches, and that is actually a forest now. The trees are, I would say, about 75 feet high.
Wow. And do you tend the trees there, or are they kind of doing their own thing?
Those I just planted, and that was it. I watered them. My philosophy when I plant any trees or shrubs is I don't get plants that are too big, so that they establish quickly if they're not too big, and I plant them carefully. I mulch them well, and I water religiously the whole first season. And after that, they're on their own.
And it sounds like they're doing really well.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I want to be there and eat all that fruit.
You mentioned something about soil management. So on this land, in one way, it's unfortunate, but the soil is very rich. It's river bottom soil. So basically, I can dig a post hole 3 feet deep in about 6 minutes. No rocks. It's either a silt loam, and then it gets a little heavier clay loam. So it's really heavenly. The downside to it is one of my main interests is soil besides fruit. And since I write about it and I teach about soil, it'd be better if I had a bad soil and I could say I made it so good. It really did start out very good, but I did make it even better.
Lee, if you ever want an outpost to practice in on the West Coast, you can come here and stand on a shovel and it goes down maybe an inch. So yes, keep that in mind, Lee.
I have friends out there that told me that. I thought he was exaggerating. He said he plants with a jackhammer.
I think he's my neighbor. Oh my gosh. Okay, so Lee, you say your farmden is a test site for innovative techniques in soil care, pruning, and growing plants. And I'm wondering, before we start getting into the details about this, how long have you been tending the land there?
About 40 years. That sounds frightening when I think of it.
Well, you know what? That really is like staying in one place and being able to watch the transformation of the plants, I bet is so rewarding.
Well, I really appreciate it because, before that I was in school and graduate school and and took off from school. But I always like growing fruits, and it's really bad if you're really into growing trees, such as fruit trees, if you have to keep moving. So I really, even now, I appreciate not having moved.
So, getting back to how you actually have such amazingly healthy and nutritious plants, because we do know that nutrition in plants, when you pick it, right from the garden, it's much higher in nutrition. But you say that you nurture the ground from the top down, and you advocate gardening like Mother Nature by using a system that's good for plants and people and that really emulates natural conditions. And so, can you chat a bit about? I think there's four main points to your gardening method. And I think the first one is no till, right? Just stop tilling. Can you tell us a bit about this?
Yeah, so I guess it started out when I entered agriculture cold. Like, I didn't come from a farming background or really a gardening background. And I actually started out, I became interested in agriculture, and I was actually in graduate school in chemistry, and I dropped out for a year, and then I decided to go back. I was just became crazed over gardening, which I still am. And early on, I noticed that everybody's always talking about weeds, and I started thinking, why this obsession with weeds? Why there's so many? So I started reading a lot about past books, even from 70 years ago, on alternatives to make for wet alternative soil management for less weeds. And what I found was a lot of the reasons for the weeds were the result of tillage. Because tillage, there's weed seeds buried in every soil, and they stay dormant until they're exposed to light. So when you till the soil, you expose the seeds to light, and although it might look like you've left a clean slate, you've actually also sown seeds. So I started, and this was a long time ago, I started thinking about this, and I started thinking, well, maybe I'll just stop tilling the soil, which I did. And you can't just stop tilling the soil, because then the next question is, why do people till the soil in the first place? So I figured out one reason is because I think it makes people feel good, because people really, you get this great feeling when you're finished, and maybe it's spring and you got some exercise outside. And so that's the main reason. But another reason, a more valid or a more practical reason, is that it stops the soil from being compacted. And that's saying, why does the soil get compacted? And the reason it gets compacted is because, especially in a vegetable garden or even a farm, you're going back and forth. You're weeding, you're thinning, you're harvesting, you're replanting, and all that walking on it packs down the soil. And if you look at natural systems, for instance, like the meadow that I have to the south of me, or forests, the plants grow fine, and nobody ever tills them. So I was thinking, what I can do here in the garden, I'll just lay out permanent beds and permanent paths, and never walk in the beds. So that was the second part of the system. And then still, even if I did that, I realized that weeds would still come in. And then the way to snuff out little weeds that would come from blown in seeds, or maybe dropped by birds, would be just to put some sort of mulch on top of the surface. And this isn't, like some people talk about 6 inches of, hay or something like that. This would just be in the vegetable garden. I use compost as a mulch, an inch depth of compost. And in the past, I use wood chips, which is readily available. And the important thing is that both those are basically weed free, or very low in weeds if they're good quality. And there are other materials you could use too. So that was basically the system that I came up with, and I started doing it. And as I said, this was a long time ago, and I remember in the beginning I was a little nervous because it seems like there weren't enough weeds, and I thought maybe I trashed the soil some way, but I got used to the idea. So now that's the system.
So the main points are no tilling and then designated walking areas and then mulching. And I know there's an irrigation. We'll get to that in a
Right.
bit. But as far
Right.
as tilling goes, I knew tilling, for me, I always thought don't till because it exposes all that excess carbon goes up into the atmosphere.
Well, that too, right. That's
Yeah.
a more that wasn't that prominent at the time, but now people are more conscious of it. But that and the interesting thing about that also,
Mm-hmm.
another related to that, reasons not to till is, first of all, when you do till, you burn up the organic matter because you're putting a lot of oxygen into the soil. So it's sort of it's good to have organic matter has, biological, physical, and nutritional benefits in the soil. So if you burn it up, you're going to lose all that. So you really preserve it, and you can have your soil reach very high levels of organic matter if you don't till. And yeah, and it's also puts carbon in the air, because organic matter basically is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and becomes carbon dioxide and water. So the decomposition does occur when you don't till, but it's at a very slow rate, just slow enough to feed the plants, but not to burn it up so quickly.
Interesting. And we're at nature's pace.
Right. Totally at nature's pace, because if it gets warmer, it goes fast. If it gets warmer and moister, it goes faster. If it gets cooler and drier, it goes slower. And that's also how plants grow. When it's warmer and moist, they grow faster. So it's nice. It's all in sync.
Okay, so I always was under the impression that introducing oxygen to the soil was good. But I know in your book you were saying that it does deplete nutrients.
Well, only because when you till, you introduce oxygen too quickly. It's like blasting oxygen into the soil. I mean, it never happens in natural systems. So you're blasting oxygen into the soil, so it burns up the organic matter quickly. And interestingly, it does release nutrients very quickly. So often, say in a virgin soil, you till the soil, like the plains in the Midwest, when they tilled them, they got very good growth because you're releasing all these nutrients at once, but then you're depleting it also too quickly. So it's sort of like taking money out of a bank faster than putting it in. The only reason you need to uh, till to add oxygen is because you've compacted the soil by walking on it. So that's why you make permanent walking areas and permanent planting areas.
That makes sense. And you did mention it doesn't happen in nature because really nature doesn't till, right? It layers.
Right, right. And so that's why it's top-down gardening. You put all the good stuff on the top, and gradually it works down into the soil.
I was surprised in your book to read like kind of a thing right now is burying organic matter really deep in the soil where the deep plant roots are. And you're not a fan of that.
More than not a fan of it. There's a good reason not
Yeah.
to, but I didn't know that was a thing now. I know in older books they sometimes, well, like double digging. That's what you do with double digging. There's a few reasons why it's not good. First of all, there's
Mhm.
no oxygen down there, so instead of plants, aerobically decomposing, they really putrefy down there. And the other thing that makes that bad is when you change the layering in a soil, even if you put like a very porous layer down at the bottom of the soil, of a soil profile,
Mhm.
actually you actually create what's called a perched water table. It impedes, even though it's a porous layer, it impedes the flow of water. Water will stop right there, and this is a fact. This is just something that can be demonstrated. And I remember years ago, I saw a video that was put out in 1963 for a soil science lecture of showing this with glass panels and different layers, how the water just stops. And it can be explained. It's just basically you need sufficient hydraulic head to push it into the porous layer, so it builds up until it gets that much hydraulic head. But that makes for a waterlogged soil above it for quite a while, especially if it's a clay soil.
I think I have seen that happen. I am a survivor. I survived double digging many years ago.
Well,
My
I always
back.
tell people if they want to dig or double dig, they should, because you do get this physical and sort of psychological uplift from it. You set aside like a 2 foot by 2 foot area in your garden. That'll be a double digging area, and then hopefully weed, because you have to come back and weed it.
That's then you're like, I got my fix for the dig and the weeding. I think too of soil. So you think of a forest floor where these layers build up. We're continually digging, we're just upending everything. Because I just think of what little integrity there is in that soil would just be pummeled, right?
Right. Yeah, it discombobulates it. Also, the fungi don't like it because they have these hyphae. They all get broken up. It just really messes up everything. I should, before I continue to rail on about
Mhm.
against digging, I should say that it's not a religion, and there are certain instances where digging is justified. And also, there's different ways. Agriculture is not a totally natural system. So, and when you garden, you don't not leaving things just to Mother Nature. You're planting stuff and you plant them in certain places. So there are various systems of gardening, and some of them I'm sure you could justifiably till. Even if you're not going to till, you might want to till once.
That was my next question was how would you create a new garden bed?
Well, the first thing I would do is check water drainage, and if water drainage is good, if water drainage is not good, I would either move the garden or do raised beds, or yeah, I mean, you could put in drainage ditches. There's all sorts of ways to deal with that. But if the drainage is good, you just want to kill the existing vegetation in place, especially if it's lawn grass, for instance, which a lot of gardens start on, and lawn grass, the soil structure underneath lawn grass is very good because grasses have extensive root systems, so you don't want to discombobulate that by tilling it up. And so you would just want to kill it in place. And the easiest way to kill it in place is to lay down paper. And you can use newspaper. I typically found in the average lawn, say 4 sheets of newspaper, wet it as you put it down, and then you top that with compost or wood chips or whatever you're going to use in the beds and the paths. And then the whole idea is I know that some permaculture people really like to use cardboard. I don't like to use cardboard because it lasts too long. What I want to do is have whatever's that barrier is break down by the time the vegetation beneath is dead. And then, and then worms and other organisms can start mixing the ingredients in with the soil.
Wow, that makes sense. And that seems easy too.
It's easy. So the nice thing about it is instantaneous. Typically, I remember when I started my first garden, I did till. This was, I was young and foolish, and and I tilled the garden. And if it's lawn or weeds or something, you have to wait a couple of weeks while the biological activity calms down, and then after a couple of weeks, you really have to till it again because you didn't necessarily get everything like perennial weeds. So you till it again, you got to wait another couple of weeks, and then you can garden, and then you're going to have a ton of weeds. But if you do it using this method, basically, I know my brother had this site, and I told him about this method, and he did it, and it was unbelievable. His neighbors thought he was a magician. He had this one grassed area, and then over the weekend he did this, and on Monday he had a garden planted because he had some transplants too. They were in the He put them in the ground in the garden. That was it.
Wow, that's amazing. And so, really, for people who are looking to turn part of their lawn into a garden, this would be a good way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, even if it's just a field of weeds, you just mow it down to get it flat. Whatever you can do to flatten it out so you can put the paper on top and the various mulches on top of that.
And it's important to leave that organic matter on the soil and then cover it.
Pretty important. I mean, if you had to take it off, it wouldn't be the end of the world. You just compost it and then add it later after it becomes compost. But you're going to add organic matter. Say in my garden, it's either wood chips or compost on top of the paper.
Okay, gotcha. And then walking areas are super, like designated walking areas are very important in your method of gardening because I think it really, like you were saying, it lessens compaction and it really respects the soil so we don't walk on where we're growing things.
Right. Even my daughter, when she first learned how to walk, I guess she just picked up the vibes. She never stepped in the soil. I don't think I ever told her.
Aw. She's like, I know that's not where dad walk. I've got to walk over here. Um, and so, go
There's
ahead.
one funny story. I don't know
Uh-huh.
if we have time for it, but I'll just make it
Yeah,
quick.
yeah.
So I had this actually a garden writer here. He was quite well known, and the paths sometimes get the stuff from the that's growing in the beds. In some cases, it will be sort of flowing over onto the paths.
Hmm.
So it's not to the uninitiated. It's not obvious where to walk and where not to walk. So I was talking to this guy, and I walked down the path. Then he started walking up the middle of a bed.
Oh no.
And just my automatic reaction was I let out this scream, and he froze. He didn't know what he was doing, and then I told him.
You're like, out, get off.
And I really have this very firm thing about stepping in the beds.
No, because once you step, especially if the soil is light and fluffy, you can definitely, there's that indentation of your foot. It's like, I'm
Right, right.
sorry. Oh my gosh.
Evidence.
Yes, exactly. Did he write a good article about you?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I I explained to him that I had overreacted and why.
Okay, so mulching is very, very important. And someone I interviewed once said that bare soil is the devil's playground, and I always, I always remembered that. So nature really doesn't. I mean, there's hardly any areas in nature, right, where there's bare soil. Can
Well,
you?
never.
Yeah,
Bare,
yeah,
bare
right.
soil,
Uh-huh.
weeds come in. I mean, unless it's, desert and there's never water or hardly ever water, but basically any soil that gets reasonable moisture through the year, weeds come in and they clothe the soil, and over time they improve the soil.
So it's kind of strange that we have these large, areas of bare soil. And so I'm wondering if anything can be mulch. And is there like malevolent mulch? Is there bad mulch? Or can pretty much anything be mulch?
I'm not choosy. I know people sometimes say with wood chips, there's a whole big thing about Ramio wood chips. I don't know if you're familiar with
Mm-mm.
that.
No.
Ramio wood chips. People specify that that's the best wood chips because they're from smaller branches. I think less than 2 inches in diameter, and the whole reason is because that they and it's true. Smaller branches have more nitrogen in it than fatter branches because there's less wood inside. But it doesn't really matter. It's over time when you add any organic matter to the soil over time, any nitrogen that's in that will be released. And unless you're trying to grow like commercial agriculture where you need a quick burst of nitrogen, which I don't do that. Um, there's no rush to get the nitrogen out of it. So Ramio wood chips are one thing, but if you get chips from an arborist, I don't think you can specify. Just give me the ones from 2 inches or less diameter wood. So I think it's very impractical, and
Mm-hmm.
and some people specify some kinds of wood that'll last longer or not last longer. I mean, I don't. I'll take any kind of wood, and if it doesn't last as long, that just means it's breaking down into organic matter faster. My main criteria for mulch is that it be weed free, or pretty much weed free, which is one thing I like about wood chips.
Right. Can you tell us maybe a couple of your other favorite mulches? I think in your book you talked about using leaves on site, grass clippings, shells,
Right.
and hulls. Maybe just share with us a
Well,
few of your faves.
well, those are options. I mean, basically, I like to get free mulch. So I have a sign out in front of my house: wood chips wanted, and arborists can just drop it off. And then in the fall, I do it's like a time machine in reverse. When people around here they rake up their leaves, they put them in bags,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a sort of a suburban development a couple of miles up the street. So I do the reverse time, and they contact me, and I pick up their bags of leaves, and then I dump them out
Uh,
here. So I do like 10 or 15 truckloads every year, and this is organic matter. I don't know what's going to happen to it otherwise, but I make good use of it.
and I bet you're popular with all the neighbors.
Yeah, I started out with a sign: free leaf pickup. I don't know if they had to pay people to pick it up or not, but I don't charge them. And now I have a mailing list. They just call me when it's time.
Oh, that's great. That's so good. So leaves are good, and that's also turning waste into value.
Yeah, though I hate to call it waste, it is
Mm-hmm.
turning
Oh,
what
because there is no
people.
waste in nature, right?
Right, that's the thing. There's so many waste products of civilization that could be used to increase soil fertility.
I read too in your book about pine needles being a possible mulch. What do you think of pine needles?
I think they're fine. I mean, the one thing about that is I feel like if somebody has, a woodsy area with pine needles, I hate to take the pine needles away from the trees.
Hmm.
But there's nothing wrong with pine needles. And one myth that some people have is if you want to make the soil more acidic, you use pine needles as a mulch or oak leaves. I mean, that's a myth. Basically, any mulch you use, the soil pH initially drops, and then it sort of gradually moves up to towards neutral.
Oh, I didn't know that. Interesting.
Yeah.
I have heard for years that pine needles are acidic and not to use them.
Yes. Have I. But yeah, there's things that people don't get the facts on, and there's a lot of stuff that's just repeated, through literature, the internet, just myths. There's a few good books out on myths, garden myths.
Didn't you write one about how science, a bit of science, can help your gardening?
It was called The Ever Curious Gardener, and it basically takes different scientific principles and shows how you can apply these in the garden to make your garden better.
And it sounds like it's working in your garden.
Oh yeah. No, I often think it because sometimes when I'm doing something like making compost, all of a sudden I realize that even though I'm just sort of making compost, and somebody looked at me and they say, "Oh, he's just piling the stuff up," but in the back of my mind, I realized that the training I had in soil science and soil biology is all going into how exact little details of how I'm doing it. And I do make really good compost, I have to say, in all modesty.
Well, I love the riddle that you told in one of your videos where you said, "What will weed your garden, feed your garden, water your garden, and take out your trash?"
Right. And not the ideal teenager.
Yes, compost. And we're going to learn about that. I had one more quick question about mulch, which was, what about living mulch? Do you think that's a practical way of covering soil?
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, cover crops are one way to do that for a time period, not a perennial one. But yeah, I'm interested in that, and I haven't done that much with it just because my soil is so rich in organic matter after all these years of the way I've been caring for it. It really seems like it's unnecessary, but it would be interesting to look more at that.
And then one of the other points that's really important that you talk about in the book is proper and effective irrigation. And so, can you just say a few things about why we know why this is important? So plants live, but just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of drip irrigation for a number of reasons. It saves water. It doesn't wet the plant leaves, so less chance of disease. It also, very important, it feeds water more at a rate that plants use the water. I mean, plants are, on a sunny day, plants are using water all the time. And if you irrigate, if you just put a sprinkler on, at 8 o'clock in the morning, the water's in the soil and then it gradually goes out of the soil. But drip irrigation, it's always in the soil and it's never making the soil waterlogged. The main problem with drip irrigation or with any of these systems is people have to know how much water to give the plants. And I know in California, you have to be much more precise since you don't get any rainfall. I don't know about where you are, but parts of California, I know you get no rainfall from May to October
Yes.
or something like that. And also, you're more restricted in your water, so you want to really not waste water. But there are guidelines, and I'm not as exacting as I would have to be in California, but I'm very conscious of how much water I'm putting down.
That's always been tricky for me is figuring out how much water to give plants. I I think I tend to overwater, but not here in California so much, but my I always think, "Oh, they need water," and then I feel down and they don't.
Right, because a lot of times people just, I have this pet peeve when I see people standing outside, say it's like early evening, and they have maybe a cup of coffee in one hand, and they have a hose and they're watering plants the other hand. So if you compute how much water is coming out, say the hose spreads the spray from the hose spreads 4 feet wide. So I computed that if somebody was trying to water the plant adequately, which means put down an inch of water,
Hmm.
they would have to stand immobile like that for 1 hour.
Oh, geez.
Just on the average. And nobody, even somebody that's as relaxed as just standing there in the early evening coolness with a cup of coffee in their hand, then I go stand there unmoving for an hour.
Wow. Were you over at our house? No, I'm kidding. No. Oh my gosh, that's scary.
I always feel like stopping as I drive by a house and somebody's doing that and saying, you know, that's really not doing anything. Although I have never stopped. I don't think I'd be well received. It does something for the gardener though. I mean, I think it looks cool. Would see all the water on the leaves and they look very happy.
Yes, and in places like California with such drought now, I think you cannot do that. I mean, you can, but in certain areas, but it's not good to
Right.
do that. So we put in some drip here, and it really does help deliver the
Right.
water effectively.
Drip irrigation, I think, is great. The main problem with drip irrigation, which I have had occasionally, like any system, it doesn't, it's not fail safe. So I realized that this year my garden is better than ever, and I only drip irrigate my vegetable gardens and my blueberries. And this year the vegetables are better than ever. And I remembered that last year and the year before there was some problem with the drip, and it had gotten clogged up for various reasons, and I didn't find out as soon as I should have. And this year I have on my calendar to check it every week, and it's amazing the difference.
And so, really, Lee, in speaking with you, and just in my experience, I think that conventional gardening, like kind of typical gardening, creates the conditions for weeds and the soil just to die. um, and so, there are you have some top ways to increase soil fertility, which we've talked about many of them here. But one of them is compost. And so I think you've
Right.
said in videos to treat your compost like a pet. Can you
Right.
tell us a bit about why you are such an advocate for compost?
Well, first of all, because it seems like the most natural feed. It's basically organic matter. As it breaks down slowly, it's feeding the plants. You just have to add enough of it to feed the plants. So in my vegetable gardens, which is really the main place I use compost. Maybe on young trees I might use compost also, but the vegetable gardens, because vegetables are annual plants and they really are hungry for food. So in the vegetable garden, I used to put down about an inch of compost in the beds only. The paths get wood chips. I'd put down an inch of compost, and then just to make sure they were getting enough nitrogen, because that would be the only thing that would be lacking with all that compost. I used to use soybean meal, which is an organic feed. It breaks down slowly in sync with plant growth because it's broken down by microorganisms when it's cool. I mean, when the weather is warm and moist. But I kept thinking that I should be able to do this with just compost, and I made these calculations just on average how much nitrogen would be released by certain amounts of compost. And it turns out that an inch depth of finished compost would supply all the nutrients that plants would need, intensively grown vegetables that the vegetables would need for a whole season, even with sequence planting and
Wow.
intercropping and all that. So a few years ago, I decided to walk my talk, and I actually stopped using the soybean meal, and now I only put down an inch of compost every year.
And that's it for your soil?
Yeah, and the other
Really?
thing nice about it, I'm recycling all sorts of stuff, and I'm not having to buy fertilizers that get shipped in. So it's one of my special interests besides organic growing is sustainable soil management. And to me, it's not totally sustainable if you're always hauling things in, because then you're taking something from somewhere else and having to bring it in. And it's cheaper to use compost. I mean, it costs nothing.
Well, so you are actually making compost on site. And I believe, and I was one of them up until like 10 years ago. I always just thought, oh, you just throw things on a pile and you're continually throwing them on a pile and that will make
Uh-huh.
compost. But that's not true, right? I mean, it eventually will, but I think you have a method that you follow to make the compost.
Right. It is true that eventually any organic material piled up will become compost. But if you're going to do just one thing to make good compost or make compost, the one thing that I would suggest would be to have an enclosure, a bin, because for a few reasons. First of all, it keeps the material together. Depending on the bin, it might keep out scavengers, might keep the heat in, the moisture in, and mostly it makes it look like a compost pile, not a garbage pile.
Mm-hmm. Which
So,
is
so I basically I have to say that I do make more compost than I should because I'm crazed about making it. I mean, a garden writer was once here, and he said that looks like I grow compost, and I just grow a garden just as a vehicle for something to do with my compost, which has some truth in it. Yeah, but the bin is the most important. Over the years, I've gone through a number of incarnations of compost bins, and for the last few years, I've had what I consider to be the ultimate compost bin.
And can people see your compost bin? I think you have videos online where people can actually see what we're talking about.
Yeah, or if you look on my blog and just do a search on the blog in the search window and just say compost bin, because I talk about it quite often, and it really has worked out well. And because it's really good at keeping the heat and the moisture and most of the scavengers out, and it makes good compost.
How long from start to finish does it take for you to make compost?
Well, when I started out making compost years ago, and wanted compost quickly. I needed a lot of compost. I used to build a pile over the course of a month. Uh, build a pile and then let it sit for a month, and then turn it, let it sit for another month, and then use it. But now I have so much compost, I can be more relaxed. What I do is typically I'll build a pile through the growing season. As I get things from the field, from the garden, and even some of my old clothes, if they're cotton or if they're wool or some natural material, I'll throw them in the compost. Old shoes, gloves, so anything that's biodegradable. So so typically build it through the growing season. And when I build it, I do build it very deliberately. I'm very conscious of what I'm putting in it and what the texture is so it doesn't get anaerobic. And also I water it to make sure things get going quickly. And then I'll let it sit all winter. And then spring, I'll typically turn it. And the reason I turn it is to make it so that any parts that didn't get decomposed enough will be more in the center of the pile, and also I can check it then for how decomposed it was since I first assembled it, and also perhaps it needs water, or maybe it's too wet, and then I can fluff it up a little. So I'll turn it in spring, and then I'll use it definitely that fall, or often through the growing season, depending on my needs and the state of decomposition. But I have a lot of compost. I have bins that are by 4 by 4 by 4,
Wow.
which is a little over a ton of compost, and I probably have about 10 of them.
Oh my gosh, I think that writer was right. And in your book, you say that it's okay to add weeds and disease or insect ridden plants to compost.
Yeah.
Is
Uh-huh.
that true?
Yeah, don't cut that out. That's I add everything to compost. I've never not There's nothing I have not put in a compost that's biodegradable. People often, uh, professionals even write sometimes if you have a diseased plant, don't put it in the compost because I don't know the disease will stay there or spread. But if you I contend that if you look closely enough at any plant part that you're going to compost,
Hmm.
like with a microscope, some way, you would find some insect or disease pest on just about everything,
Mm.
some amount. So I just put everything in, and time and some combination of time and temperature is what kills everything, or doesn't kill it, or it promotes antagonists that attack it. So I've never not used everything in my compost, and this is like for decades, and I've never had a problem.
I mean, forever, I take things with powdery mildew. I put them in the
Ah,
green waste instead because I learned that years ago when I first was
yeah,
learning how to garden.
yeah, yeah. I hate it when I read that. Take this thing and put it in a plastic bag and bring it to the landfill.
Yeah.
I have a big aversion to landfills.
Oh my gosh, I know.
It seems like a disrespect for the soil.
Well, in permaculture, we often say that a successful system produces no waste. So I would say you definitely have a successful system going.
All right. Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to share with people about composting or the specifics of your gardening methods that we didn't cover?
I would say just don't do too much too fast, or you'll be disenchanted, or you'll get too tired or something. I tell people when sometimes I do workshops here or tours here at the farmden, and I always tell people, they're oohing and ahhing, and I say one thing: don't do this at home, because it's like I've gone overboard. It's sort of like an addiction. I can't control myself, but it's really too much here. I mean, too many plants to take care of, too much compost, but I can't. I keep thinking I should cut something back, and maybe I will someday, but I haven't yet.
That's great. And I'm sure the plants are so happy to be living on your farm then.
And fortunately, I do usually get some volunteers here, and I have to admit, the last few years I've gotten the best volunteers. Unbelievable.
And you're talking about people and not plants.
I do get volunteer plants, and some of them are the best. But the people, yeah, the people. I'm very thankful for that, because I would probably cut back sooner if I didn't have these good volunteers.
Oh, that's great. And if people want more information, they can find you online at Lee, Lee Reich, REICH.com. And so, Lee, really, I had just a couple more questions. If someone is interested in growing fruit trees, would you say that they should fine tune the soil management methods that we were talking about to grow fruit as opposed to veggies, or is it kind of across the board?
Yeah, I don't. People get into very specifics about even in commercial, if you go to a garden center and they're just selling regular fertilizer, they have fertilizer for tomatoes, fertilizer for roses. I mean, the most important thing for soil, for fruit tree or for vegetables, is good drainage, and then fertility from the top down. You don't bury organic matter in a hole. You just put organic matter on top, and then the second most important thing, or another important thing, besides whether you're growing fruits or vegetables, is adequate moisture, whether it's coming from the sky or whether you have to add it. So I think drainage is important, and moisture, and organic matter.
Okay, interesting. Because I have studied this for probably since I was 20, so a long, long time. And I learned things in your book, which
Oh,
I
good.
didn't know. Yes, I'm never gonna
That's
for
heartening.
decades I've been throwing away diseased plants.
Oh, yeah.
What a waste, literally.
The thing is that I said it's like time. If your compost doesn't get hot, you just have to let it sit longer. If it does get hot, you can do it quicker.
And are you using a temperature gauge to, or no, for the
I do
compost?
only because I like to measure things. So I always take the temperatures of my compost. They're always the same, and but it's nice to know. And that typically my compost get up to about 150 degrees. You can nowadays, just about everywhere there are people selling compost. Not like it used to be. Somebody cleans out an old barn and they're selling that as compost. But there are places that sell good compost that's actually tested and all that. So I wouldn't be averse to buying that. It's just I like to make compost. But some people don't have time to make compost, or they don't feel like they want to do that. So I would just search out a good place to buy compost. In my book, I have a little section on how to, questions to ask to determine, is this compost good? But yeah, I think just buying compost is fine also.
And the book that we've been chatting about is Weedless Gardening. Okay, lastly, Lee, and you've had many decades of gardening successes, it sounds like, and gardening. What are you most proud of, would you say?
Wow. Well, I guess one thing is when I plant trees, I find trees very satisfying. Not even necessarily fruit trees, like the maple trees I planted, and I planted a honey locust, because after being in the same place for a long time, I mean, it's really sort of cool to see this really dramatic feature of the landscape that I put in the ground. And also some trees I do sometimes if I know a tree and I want to grow it and I don't want to, I guess I could buy it, but it's more satisfying to plant seed. So I'll collect seeds from the tree and I'll plant it, And I have some trees that I planted from seed that are now maybe 15 feet high, and they're growing fast. It's just very satisfying. But I guess that's a whole different topic from fruits and vegetables.
Well, it's interesting, right? I can see how that would be, and that tree is going to be
Yeah,
there for a long time.
it's especially nice. And I guess, yeah, I mean, the fruits and vegetables is just it's just nice, and it's good eating, and challenging in some ways.
On a larger scale, so we've been talking kind of about your garden and how we might garden like this. How do you think on a larger scale that gardening, if people adopted these methods, how would this affect the broader world, than just our own backyards?
Right. Well, that's something I often think of. Like, here I am in my backyard, and I do all this stuff about like a farm or a small farm. And I'm happy to say that, and not that all small farms are doing this, but around here where I live, there's a lot of small farms, and they have, I know one or more than one, a number of them have adopted this no-till method. One farmer, he said that he started doing it. He's very successful. He said he started doing it about maybe 20 plus years ago. And he said it was all because of me, which I don't remember, but I'll take credit anyway. and and then I do know, some bigger farmers. They're still on the small farm scale that have used this, and it seems to work. There's certain limitations to adopting it to a small farm. You have to figure out how to make that much compost or buy that much compost, figure it in. But it's nice that it can work on a smaller farm, and I mean a bona fide farm. And it'd be nice if it could be scaled up, because the way it is now, it takes a lot of energy to grow crops, as far as petroleum energy to make fertilizers in commercial agriculture. It'd be nice if more. It's really a social and a political problem, and maybe an economic problem. All the waste products that we have could contribute a lot to the fertility in agriculture, or maybe totally. But it's just they're not. They have to be. People have to be willing to use them, and then figure out ways to get them in the right place at the right time. One of my Another one of my pet peeves is, I don't know if you've heard this, but people say that we may be about to, or maybe we have reached peak phosphorus.
No, I'm not familiar with it.
Yes, so phosphorus is an important nutrient, and most phosphorus fertilizer comes from rock phosphate, which is mined mostly in Florida in this country, and then it's treated with acids to become phosphorus fertilizer. And basically, it's not renewable, and it seems like maybe it's being used up. And the interesting thing is, so when my soil has been tested, so I've never added extra phosphorus or potassium, and because the organic matter that I use, or the organic matter that anybody would use, is high enough in that, so that over time my soil now checks out as excessive potassium and phosphorus. So it's sort of like this thing: we have peak phosphorus, and people are worried about it, and we have this source of organic materials that could provide all that phosphorus, but they're not getting shoveled around to the right places. Or yeah, I mean, and a lot of it has to do with, as I said in the beginning, the bulk organic matter. This is heavy stuff, so you gotta. It's not just like a bag you just open and spread it. It's a bulky. It's a truckload of stuff.
It's like an untapped resource is waste.
Yeah,
Maybe that's
and
your
it's just,
next book.
yeah. Well, it's frustrating to hear about peak phosphorus, and then I have my soil tested where I never had phosphorus, and it's got like excessive phosphorus.
So there are ways to create healthy soil without having to use all these inputs from that maybe aren't the most sustainable sources.
Yeah, totally. If you had enough compost, you could, as I do here, you could feed the plants all they need.
It's exciting, right? That there are ways to garden and farm without using, you know, um, herbicides, pesticides.
Right.
And I'm so glad that you could join me today.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was so fun. You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. You can find us online at sustainableworldradio.com and also on iTunes. For more information about permaculture and ecology, visit the Sustainable World Media YouTube channel, where you'll find videos about permaculture, aquaponics, organic gardening, rainwater harvesting, and much, much more. Sustainable World Radio is a listener-supported program. If you like what we do, please consider making a donation to the show. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier, and thank you so much for listening.